October 1986. A 26-year-old computer engineer drove from London to Bristol in an Audi 80 automatic. He entered a motoring accessories store named Bits Z Cars and purchased a nylon tow rope. Then he tied one end to a tree in a public space and the other around his neck. The man was Ashad Sharif, an employee of GEC-Marconi, one of the most important defense contractors in Britain. He worked in the highly specialized field of underwater weapons simulation, the kind of computer modeling used to test torpedoes, sonar systems, and missile interception scenarios. During the Cold War, Britain's nuclear capabilities and deterrence existed almost entirely underwater, systems designed to operate hidden beneath the ocean, far from shore. Defense contractors like Sharif developed and simulated missiles that could navigate saturated interception environments, a system that distinguishes real targets from decoys, that adapts to a field of hundreds of countermeasures, and it didn't end underwater. Marconi and other British defense contractors were tied directly to Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, also known as Star Wars. It was an attempt to change the rules of nuclear war, to make one side believe it could survive the unthinkable. When work like this exists at the crossroads of nuclear extinction, intelligence warfare, and absolute secrecy, a bizarre death can be meant as a message. Horrifyingly, it was discovered that Sharif was only one name in a list of many. Within months, 3 of his co-workers died under bizarre circumstances. Within 2 years, the bodies of over 20 scientists were discovered. In cars filled with exhaust, in burning wreckages, in ritualistic electrocutions, in quiet rooms with plastic bags over their heads. Their work attempted to remove the guarantee of mutually assured destruction, and it would have meant the Cold War was no longer cold. As the scientists closest to this work began dying, speculation rushed to fill the silence. For most of human history, the end of the world lived in myth. It was vague and symbolic. But in the second half of the 20th century, the apocalypse became something else. It became a calculation. For decades, men filled quiet rooms with humming machines that would look primitive today. Cabinets of hardware, tape and disc, green text on black screens, where engineers reduced global annihilation to logic gates and conditional statements, ones and zeros to represent cities, oceans, everything anyone had ever loved. The end of the world was trapped inside the RAM and ROM of 1980s computers, running on clocks slow enough that you could hear time passing between operations. The apocalypse was made banal, mundane, simple lines of code designed to answer impossible questions. They were simulations designed to understand how missiles might be intercepted in a complex environment, calculating intervention across trajectories that spanned thousands of miles, how defenses could survive saturation and noise. Conversely, the same models could be used to imagine the opposite, how a weapon could evade those defenses, exploit those blind spots, and survive interception. How a nuclear weapon could make impact. The horror isn't that we began to ask questions about the end of the world. It's that we began answering them. The men who built these systems were not abstractions. They were ordinary people whose working lives were spent inside a future that was never supposed to exist. As a result, they lost the only future that was their own. March 1982. If this story were told the way it usually is, this is the part that gets skipped. 4 years before the deaths began to attract the attention of journalists and politicians, before anyone knew about the Marconi Conspiracy, there was Keith Bowden. Bowden was a senior computer scientist, older than most of the men that would follow. By the early 1980s, he was well established in his field, working in advanced computing with links to defense-related research. He was the kind of man whose work didn't make headlines because it wasn't supposed to. One night in March, after attending a social function in London, Bowden drove home through Essex. He never made it to his destination. His vehicle inexplicably left the road, went off a bridge, and plunged onto a disused railway line. The impact was fatal. There were no other vehicles involved, no eyewitnesses or signs of mechanical failure. His wife believed that her husband's vehicle had been tampered with. According to later reporting, the family hired a private investigator who claimed that the vehicle's tires had been replaced with worn retreads shortly before the crash, a change that would have significantly affected handling, especially at that speed. The allegation was never pursued. At the time, there was no pressure to pursue it. A late-night crash involving a middle-aged man returning home from a social event did not look like a mystery. It looked like an accident with an unfortunate explanation. Keith Bowden's death did not raise alarms because there was nothing to compare it to. There was no second data point, no reason to believe this was anything other than tragedy shaped by chance and circumstance. Only years later would Bowden's case be revisited, not as proof, but as a question that had been answered too quickly. In 1982, it was only just beginning. In April 1983, another name was added to the list. Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Godley, 49, was the head of the work-study unit at the Royal Military College of Science, one of Britain's most important defense education institutions. He was an Army expert, embedded inside a system built on procedure and routine. On the morning he vanished, nothing appeared out of order. Godley left home for what should have been a half-mile walk to his office. Before leaving, he told his wife that if anyone called, she should say he was on his way in to work. Days later, his yellow MG sports car was found abandoned in a public car park in Folkestone, Kent, a coastal town more than 100 miles away. Inside the vehicle were waterproof clothing and a revolver that was not Army issued. The gun contained no ammunition. The Ministry of Defense moved quickly to minimize the implications. Officials stated that his disappearance was not a security threat and described the search as a routine matter. There was no suggestion that classified material had been compromised. Behind the scenes, something else happened. A colleague later stated that all of Godley's documents had been taken by the Ministry of Defense. Whatever work he had been doing, whatever papers he had kept, they had been quietly collected. No explanation followed. Godley's father, a retired magistrate's clerk, suggested his son may have suffered a breakdown. Neighbors described him as private and unfamiliar in the community. Anthony Godley has never been found, and like Bowden's death the year before, Godley's case did not raise wider concern. It did not connect to anything else. At the time, it looked like a personal collapse. Only later would it look like something else. In March 1985, Roger Hill was 49 years old. He was a radar designer linked to Marconi and to defense-related electronics work. His role existed inside systems designed to see what others could not. Objects at a distance, signals buried in noise. Hill was found dead in his home from a shotgun blast. The circumstances of his death were investigated, and the case was closed without a prolonged inquest. No wider concerns were raised publicly at the time. There were no reports of third-party involvement, no indication on paper that anyone else had been present, no public dispute over the conclusion. And that is why this case disappeared almost immediately. In fact, there is no trace of it within newspaper archives, only third-hand sources alluding to Hill's tragedy. Deaths like this do not attract scrutiny. They resolve cleanly in administrative terms. Roger Hill's name passed quietly through the record. At the time, there was no reason to connect it to anything else. Only later, when other men in similar roles began dying under stranger circumstances, would Hill's death be reconsidered. Jonathan Walsh was a young communications engineer employed by British Telecom, working in advanced digital communications associated with their secret Martlesham Health Research Facility. The building was deeply tied to defense communications, encryption, and classified research. In November 1985, Walsh was overseas on business when he died. He was staying at a hotel in Abidjan, the capital of the Ivory Coast. He fell from a balcony and was killed. The circumstances were treated locally as an isolated incident, but there was a detail that refused to stay quiet. Before his death, Walsh had expressed fear for his life. That fact emerged later through his family. His father, John Walsh, would spend years pressing for answers, frustrated by what he described as a wall of silence from both the Foreign Office and British Telecom. Requests for clarification went unanswered, and explanations were minimal. Distance helped contain the story. A death abroad is easier to categorize. Jurisdiction fragments responsibility. Paperwork crosses borders slowly, if at all. Walsh's death did not look like part of anything larger. It was simply a tragedy that belonged to another country. Bristol, August 1986. Vimal Dajibhai was 24 years old, recently married and employed as a junior computer engineer at Marconi Underwater Systems near Watford. His work focused on torpedo guidance software. According to contemporaneous reporting, the software he worked on was more complex than standard anti-ballistic software. It was part of a broader effort to simulate how weapons behave inside saturated, deceptive environments, where submarines, missiles, and countermeasures all interact. Internally, this work fed into a classified simulation effort known as Project Cosmos, which was described as the wargame to end all wargames. It simulated nuclear war, integrating missiles, submarines, and satellites, and it was framed as having profound implications on Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative. However, Dajibhai was planning to leave Marconi and transferred to a better-paying career at the City of London. On the day he died, he drove more than 100 miles west from London to Bristol. There was no clear reason for the journey, no meeting, no connection to the city. His car was later found containing a bottle of red wine and 2 paper cups, an odd detail for someone who reportedly rarely drank. From there, he walked to the Clifton Suspension Bridge. His body was found in the gorge below. Even early on, his death resisted closure. Investigators noted that his pants were found lowered, a detail that was never clearly accounted for. Toxicology results did not point to alcohol or drugs as a simple explanation. Puncture marks were discovered on his thighs, and no one could account for why he was in Bristol at all. At the inquest, friends and family testified about his state of mind. They spoke about his marriage, his new job, his plans for the future. The coroner returned an open verdict. Weeks later, moments before his cremation, police intervened. A second post-mortem was ordered to examine the puncture marks more closely. A statement was released attributing the marks to bone fragments caused by the fall. Officially, the anomaly was resolved, but it didn't end there. Within a few months, several others working in the same narrow simulation field began to die, some co-workers who worked on the same Marconi project. The sequence and immediacy changed everything. It drew the attention of Tony Collins, editor of Computer News, who began investigating the deaths not as isolated events, but as a cluster tied to a single domain of expertise: advanced underwater and nuclear war simulation. Only Collins had no idea how deep things would go. This story began with the death of Ashad Sharif. In October 1986, Sharif was 26 years old. He worked as a computer systems analyst for Marconi, assigned to defense projects near London. Sharif had been involved in underwater vibration and simulation work, tied to the same class of modeling related to torpedo guidance and defense simulations. Later reporting would place him on the same general project as Dajibhai. On the day he died, Sharif drove from London to Bristol. There was no obvious reason for him to be there. Police later confirmed that Sharif had stopped by a motoring accessories store called Bits Z Cars, where he purchased a nylon tow rope. They discovered his Audi in a public area nearby. Sharif was found dead inside the vehicle with injuries to his neck. One end of the rope had been attached to a nearby tree, the other to Sharif. Investigators concluded that no other person was involved. Inside the car, police found a cassette tape recorded by Sharif. On the tape, he spoke about an alleged relationship with a married former landlady. He described feelings of shame and dishonor, but when investigators contacted the woman, she denied any affair and said she had not seen Sharif for several years. Additionally, Sharif was engaged to a woman in Pakistan and was going to marry her within months. On the day of his death, he had been scheduled to meet about a visa so his fiancée could enter Britain. The family was allowed to listen to the cassette tape, and they reported that it did not sound like a goodbye message. This was now the second young Marconi-linked computer specialist to die in Bristol within a matter of weeks. Both had worked in advanced simulation environments tied to strategic defense modeling. Both had traveled significant distances for reasons that were never fully clarified. It was after the deaths of Dajibhai and Sharif that Tony Collins started comparing the employment histories and specializations of the men. His notes would expand to include many of the names listed here. They would later be converted to a book, announcing what would be known as the Marconi Conspiracy. For now, it was only the beginning. Derbyshire, January 1987. Uniquely, this is the only story that does not end with a body. Avtar Singh Gita was 26 years old, a postgraduate researcher at Loughborough University, working in underwater electronics and sonar experimentation. His work involved testing equipment at the Foremark Reservoir in Derbyshire, a quiet, controlled environment used for field trials. He was 3 weeks away from completing his doctorate. On the day he disappeared, Singh Gita was not alone. A colleague left the site briefly to buy food. When he returned, Singh Gita was gone. He had been 2 days away from his wedding anniversary and had already bought a gift for his wife. There was no indication he intended to leave his life behind. Search teams were brought in. Frogmen combed the reservoir. Nearby roads were checked. Airports were notified. Nothing turned up. Days passed, then weeks. 4 months later, in May 1987, he was found in Paris, working under an assumed name in a sweatshop in the Montmartre district. sᴜᴘᴘᴏᴛ said he did not remember how he got there. He described a series of bus rides, a gradual drift, and then a gap. No other explanation was offered. sᴜᴘᴘᴏᴛ told investigators that his work was not classified. Official statements echoed that assessment, but the case resisted closure. sᴜᴘᴘᴏᴛ had been conducting sonar and signal processing research, a field adjacent to the same underwater defense ecosystem that linked several of the earlier deaths. He knew Vimal Dajibhai informally from their time at Loughborough University. According to later reporting, he was also under contract to Marconi Space and Defense Systems and was weeks away from completing his doctoral research. Unlike the others, sᴜᴘᴘᴏᴛ survived, but part of him hadn't. 4 months of his life were gone. The path between a reservoir in Derbyshire and a workshop in Paris was missing, and no one could explain how a man vanished in broad daylight, crossed borders, and returned without memory. That same month, Richard Pugh was found dead in his home in Essex. Pugh was a computer design expert working on digital warfare systems tied to contracts with the Ministry of Defense. He lived alone in Essex. Colleagues described him as capable and technically gifted. There was no public history of instability, no known warnings, no indication that his work or personal life had recently collapsed in a way that would explain what had happened. Pugh's body was discovered with a plastic bag over his face, his feet bound, and a thick rope wrapped around his torso. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of another person being present. Nothing in the house appeared disturbed beyond the room where he was found. From the outset, the scene resisted casual explanation. Authorities did not treat it as a criminal investigation. The case was quickly explained as an indiscretion, a personal experimentation that caused a private accident. The investigation closed without examining how a man working on computerized warfare systems ended up dead in such a carefully constrained, physically complex environment. Within weeks, another man connected to the same world would be found dead, this time in his own garage, with an explanation that would once again strain believability. John Britton was 52 years old. He was a senior computer scientist and former computer science officer who worked as an expert consultant for the Ministry of Defense. His career placed him deep inside Britain's defense research infrastructure. He had also served on the Surrey Health Council. He had been married for 25 years. On January 12, 1987, during a period of heavy snowfall, Britton was found slumped over the steering wheel of his car in the garage of his home in Camberley. The engine was running. The space was small. Investigators said it would have only taken a minute or two for fumes to reach incapacitating levels. The official explanation arrived quickly. It was suggested that Britton may have started the car to warm it up, possibly at the suggestion of his son, and then lost consciousness. The death was ruled accidental. In the weeks prior, Britton had been unwell. He had suffered repeated throat infections and had taken time off work. He had also recently returned from a trip to the United States in November, after which his wife said he struggled with sleep and was prescribed sleeping pills. Just before Christmas, he had lost control of his car and driven into a ditch, an incident that unsettled those close to him. The day before his death, he had taken his son back to university. There was nothing unusual about the day itself, nothing that suggested finality. The garage told a quiet story. Investigators noted how small the space was, how quickly fumes could build, and how little time there would be to react. But for some, they raised a different question. If Britain had started or stayed in the car accidentally, how did he remain seated long enough to lose consciousness without attempting to leave? The verdict closed the file, and the death was absorbed into the background of routine tragedies. By January 1987, men in the defense sector were no longer dropping in isolation. They fell in clusters. Within weeks, another defense scientist would be found dead in a garage, this time beneath his own car, positioned in a way investigators would later describe as baffling. Peter Peapell was 46 years old. He was a lecturer at the Royal Military College of Science in Shrivenham and worked through the Cranfield Institute of Technology. Although the Ministry of Defense would later say he was not directly employed by them, his work placed him squarely inside Britain's defense research infrastructure. He was studying recent trends in beryllium metallurgy in the Soviet Union. According to official statements, the work was unclassified and relied only on open-source material. Even so, it concerned materials used in advanced weapons systems, particularly where resistance to heat, stress, and explosive force mattered. In February 1987, Peapell and his wife Maureen returned home around 3 a.m. after an evening out with friends. Maureen went to bed. Peter stayed behind to park the car. 6 hours later, he was dead. At approximately 9:30 a.m., Maureen entered the garage. The space was extremely hot. The car engine was still running. The garage door was shut. Peapell's body was found beneath the vehicle. He was lying face up, with his mouth positioned almost directly beneath the exhaust pipe. Investigators noted that the garage was small, and carbon deposits on the door suggested the engine had not been running for very long. But the positioning of the body raised immediate questions. Investigators said that, given the confined space, it would have been extremely difficult for someone to crawl under the car. It would have required the door to be open, and it couldn't be closed from beneath the vehicle without considerable effort. His wife revealed that he had been concerned about noises from beneath the vehicle. She speculated that he may have positioned himself there to investigate. Officially, the death was attributed to carbon monoxide poisoning. The coroner returned an open verdict, stating that it was not possible to determine whether the death was accidental or deliberate. Peapell wouldn't be the last. Edwin Skeels was a computer engineer. He lived alone. His house was sparsely furnished, described by neighbors as containing little more than basic furniture, his clothes, and a computer. Large quantities of printer paper were delivered regularly. His life appeared organized, contained, and almost entirely centered around his work. At the time of his death, Skeels was employed on a flight simulator program. Days before he died, he had been informed that he was to be repositioned in the company. According to people who knew him, his job was in jeopardy, and this may have weighed on him heavily, although this is only conjecture. Skeels was found inside his vehicle, the engine running and the garage filled with fumes. Neighbors reported hearing the engine running for an extended period before discovering him. Inside the house, investigators noted a cup of coffee sitting half drunk on the kitchen table. It suggested interruption, not preparation. Those who knew Skeels described him as meticulous, orderly, someone who was thorough. He was not known for impulsive behavior, and he had few close social connections. Officially, the death was attributed to carbon monoxide poisoning. Victor Moore was 46 years old. He was a design engineer at Marconi Space and Defense Systems, working at the company's Portsmouth facility. He held high-level security clearance, and his recent work involved infrared space-based satellites, systems designed to detect heat signatures across vast distances, work that could easily fit into early nuclear warning systems. Infrared satellites are built to register the first moments of a missile launch. They form one of the earliest links in the chain between detection and response. In the context of the Cold War, they were not peripheral systems. They were the first line of defense. Shortly after Moore completed his work, he died. The exact timing is unclear. Some reports place his death in February 1987. Others place it weeks later in early spring. The cause of death was reported as a drug overdose. Authorities treated the death as self-inflicted. There was no public inquest. What followed, however, was unprecedented. According to multiple reports, Moore's death triggered an internal investigation by MI5. Government officials stated that its findings would remain secret. The bizarre connections between these deaths was beginning to reach a larger audience. It was no longer the focus of independent journalists. Now government institutions were investigating to calm public concern. Additional details only deepened that opacity. Moore had recently left Marconi due to illness. The nature of that illness was never disclosed. No timeline was offered. His departure coincided closely with the completion of his satellite work. His wife later said that he had been under considerable strain. Beyond that, little else was made public about his final weeks. As the individuals connected to national security and defense research continued to disappear, security agencies were finally starting to take note. Hampshire, March 1987. Sands was 36 years old, a computer engineer employed by Marconi Defense Systems. He was working on radar software and signal processing tied directly to air defense and early warning systems. Radar systems like the one Sands worked on were designed to do something deceptively simple: determine what in the sky mattered, to distinguish aircraft from clutter, missiles from noise, threats from false artifacts. In practice, that meant defining the corridors through which an attack might pass unnoticed, and the moments where interception would still be possible. In early 1987, Sands had been involved in work examining gaps in NATO air defense coverage, particularly along routes where radar visibility was weakest. These were the kinds of vulnerabilities that existed only on classified maps, discussed in closed rooms, and never acknowledged publicly. On the night he died, Sands was driving home. Sometime after midnight, his car left the road and crashed into a tree, and he was found dead at the scene. The official explanation was straightforward. Police said Sands had been drinking and lost control of the vehicle. The death was ruled accidental. There was no public inquest that challenged that conclusion. Within days, members of Parliament began asking questions about why so many defense contractors were dying. There were obvious fears about Sands exposing weakness in nuclear detection radar systems. The Ministry of Defense replied that there was no security risk or foul play. Finally, the deaths had reached a national platform, yet still, they continued. David Greenhall was a defense manager at ICL, working inside Britain's computer and defense contract ecosystem. He was not a junior engineer or trainee. He was 46 years old and occupied a supervisory role. On an April morning in 1987, he left for work in his vehicle. Somewhere along his route in Berkshire, his car came to a stop near a bridge. What happened next is known only in fragments. Greenhall left the vehicle and fell approximately 40 feet. Unlike almost everyone else in this story, he survived the initial event. Emergency services reached him. He was taken to the hospital. He was conscious, long enough to be questioned. And when asked what happened, what his motivation was, he said he didn't know. There was no account of despair. No reference to stress or crisis. No story that could be assembled after the fact to make the moment legible. There was only an absence where intention should have been. Days later, Greenhall died from his injuries. After Greenhall, the deaths stopped arriving one at a time. In April 1987, Stuart Gooding, 23, a student at the Royal Military College, was killed in Cyprus during a military exercise. His vehicle collided during training, and the incident was treated as a traffic accident. No unresolved questions were raised. In April 1987, Mark Wisner, 24, a software engineer working for the Ministry of Defense, was found dead in his home. He had been discovered with a plastic bag over his head and cling film wrapped around his face. He was partially dressed in women's clothing. There were no signs of a struggle and no indication that anyone else had been present. That same month in Liverpool, George Kuntis, a systems analyst, drove his car into the River Mersey and drowned. The verdict was misadventure. No explanation was offered for why the car left the road. Weeks later, Michael Baker, 22, a Plessey engineer, crashed through a motorway barrier near his home. His death was also ruled a misadventure. Another young engineer, another sudden departure from the road. By early 1988, the geography shifted, but the logic did not. Russell Smith, 23, a technician at the Atomic Energy Research Establishment, was found at the base of a cliff in Cornwall in January. There were no witnesses. A few months later, Trevor Knight, 52, an engineer at Marconi Space and Defense Systems, was found dead in his car. The cause was carbon monoxide poisoning. The verdict concluded the matter. By September, Andrew Hall, 33, a manager at British Aerospace, was found dead in similar circumstances. Again, carbon monoxide. By the time you reach the end of this list of names, the details begin to blur in a particular way. Not because they're unimportant, but because there are so many similarities. It becomes difficult to remember which death belonged to which month, which jurisdiction, which company, because what you're really seeing is not a sequence of isolated tragedies, but iterations of a pattern. And while the deaths themselves are strange, it's even stranger how the world absorbs them, how they become almost routinized, even in the face of protesting families and incongruous histories. These stories become collapsed in papers and investigations in a way that refuses to acknowledge the wake these absences leave behind. This is why these stories are so important, not because they offer the clearest mystery, but because they reveal how the unthinkable can become familiar. And once something becomes familiar, it can continue for far longer than it should. In late 1988, Alistair Beckham was 50 years old. He worked as a software engineer for Plessey Defense Systems, a company deeply involved in British military electronics and later absorbed into Marconi. He was described by those who knew him as private and meticulous. On the morning of August 28th, Beckham was found dead in a garden shed behind his house. He was discovered with electrical wires attached to his body. A handkerchief was in his mouth. The positioning of the wiring and the condition of the scene indicated death by electrocution. There were no signs of forced entry, no indication that another person had been present. Unlike earlier cases, there was no obvious domestic explanation to lean on. No running engine, no fall, no illness. The physical setup itself demanded explanation. The coroner did not provide one. Beckham's wife stated publicly that the circumstances made no sense. She said that she believed her husband was murdered and just couldn't prove it. According to multiple reports, officials from the Ministry of Defense arrived at Beckham's home shortly after his death. They removed documents and files related to his work. No inventory was released. No explanation was offered. As gruesome and bizarre as this death was, it would not stand alone. John Ferry was 60 years old. He was an assistant marketing director at Marconi, responsible for service liaison and corporate relations. He had joined Marconi 7 years earlier after retiring from the Royal Artillery, and he was known for using his Army contacts to navigate military procurement and oversight. During the week, Ferry stayed in a company cottage on the grounds of the Frimley complex, close to where he worked. He was married, with a family, and commuted home on weekends. On an afternoon in August, a cleaning woman arrived at the cottage during her normal lunchtime visit. When she opened the bedroom door, she saw sparks. Ferry was found dead inside the room. Electrical wires were found in his mouth. The leads had been connected directly into a wall socket. The death was caused by electrocution. The coroner later recorded an open verdict, stating that intent could not be determined. The physical details were extreme, but they were not the only context investigators considered. Earlier that month, Ferry had been involved in a head-on collision with a truck. He had been towing engineering equipment when the crash occurred, and he became partially trapped inside the vehicle. At the same time, the professional environment around Ferry was under severe strain. In 1988, the Ministry of Defense was conducting an aggressive review of defense contracts, including scrutiny of the Battlefield Artillery Target Engagement System, also known as BATES. It was an artillery command computer project associated with the Frimley complex. The project was 4 years behind schedule, plagued by technical problems and suffering from staff turnover estimated at 40%. Marconi itself was under pressure. Defense contractors at the time spoke openly about the strain placed on them by the MOD crackdown, as contracts were delayed, canceled, or restructured. Ferry's role required him to manage those tensions, to reassure military partners, navigate oversight, and absorb institutional stress on behalf of the company. It is also notable that David Sands, whose death earlier that year had drawn parliamentary attention, worked at the same Frimley site. None of this resolved what happened in the cottage. There's no easy way to call it misadventure, no way to attribute it to ignorance or isolation, and no comfortable explanation for why the story ended there. John Ferry concludes this list, not because the story ends here, but because this is where clarity continues to degrade. There are other names, some from this same period, some that surfaced later. In several cases, explanations eventually arrived, perpetrators identified, confessions made, accidents reconstructed. What remains is not a complete picture, but a partial one, shaped by what was recorded, what was resolved, and what was allowed to disappear without ever being fully understood. Before we can even begin to speculate on why these deaths occurred, we have to understand who these men worked for. We have to know what Marconi truly was. Marconi didn't emerge suddenly in the 1980s. It had been quietly evolving alongside modern warfare. At the turn of the 20th century, it was radio, wireless transmission. By the First World War, Marconi's systems were intercepting enemy signals. By the Second, that same logic hardened into radar. Marconi engineers helped build early warning systems that didn't just detect aircraft, but interpreted returns, separating real threats from weather, reflections, and noise. Britain's survival depended on it. After the war, the battlefield didn't disappear, it submerged. Submarines replaced bombers, silence replaced visibility, and Marconi followed. By the 1950s and 60s, Marconi was developing sonar and underwater combat systems for the Royal Navy, torpedo guidance, acoustic discrimination, software that could decide algorithmically whether a contact was a submarine or something pretending to be one. By the 1970s, Marconi was no longer primarily an electronics manufacturer. It was a signal interpretation company. Radar, sonar, simulation software that could model engagements before they ever happened. As the Cold War was reaching its endgame, Marconi was a key player. By this point, a nuclear exchange was an information problem. How could you interpret a rocket when it's outside the atmosphere, potentially carrying multiple warheads, deploying decoy payloads, and traveling faster than sound? One mistake in this scenario wasn't just failure, it meant apocalypse. And Marconi wasn't just building weapons, they were building intelligence into machines. By the 1980s, Marconi was one of the few companies in the world whose expertise translated cleanly from the ocean floor to the Earth's orbit. And that's why, when the United States began reaching outside its borders for help with the Strategic Defense Initiative, Marconi was at the top of the list. The Cold War had reached a strange plateau. Both the United States and the Soviet Union possessed enough nuclear weapons to end humanity many times over, yet neither side could meaningfully defend itself from the other. This balance, known as mutually assured destruction, was grim but stable. In March 1983, Ronald Reagan proposed something radical. The Strategic Defense Initiative, quickly nicknamed Star Wars. Its stated goal was to render nuclear missiles impotent and obsolete by intercepting them before they could reach their targets. The idea came as an empty promise of a space shield. Lobbyists spoke of a future filled with orbiting lasers and impossible precision. Really, they were trying to convince the government into writing a blank check. Without mutually assured destruction, what would stop the launch of nuclear missiles? Star Wars was composed of a vast, interlocking architecture. It sought to intercept missiles in the boost phase, moments after launch. If that failed, it would destroy the payload bus before it could release warheads and decoys. If that failed, intercepting boosters would catch what remained in the terminal phase. And coordinating all these pieces was a proposed management system fast enough and accurate enough to coordinate sensors, tracking, and interceptors in real time across the planet. It would require a system that could navigate environments so complex they bordered on computational impossibility. Imagine multiple nuclear warheads launched amid decoys, shedding debris in the outer atmosphere. They would generate heat, noise, and false signals, moving through atmospheric and electromagnetic interference. By the end of the decade, even the most pragmatic officials were forced to concede what the scientists had been saying from the beginning. The program was impossible. Contracts tightened, scrutiny sharpened, and the defense sector became a place where timelines were political and silence was procedural. In that environment, the deaths looked less like unrelated tragedies and more like data points. Tony Collins made the initial connections. He was a trade journalist and editor of Computer News, covering the British electronics and defense computer sector. He had received reports of some of the victims mentioned. As the deaths continued and the connections grew larger, the story slipped into public record. Newspapers began counting the deaths. John Cartwright, a member of Parliament, stated that the cases stretched the possibility of mere coincidence too far, and he demanded an inquest. Other members joined the call for an investigation. No official answer ever arrived. There was no final report, no moment where the state, the courts, or parliament gathered the pieces and told the public what they added up to. One by one, the cases were closed, then archived. Politicians moved on. The papers did, too. The deaths slipped out of view, receding into the rearview mirror, but it left behind gaps where explanations should have been. 4 decades on, there is still no authoritative account of what these deaths meant. What follows the absence of an official explanation isn't immediate conspiracy, but something quieter and more human. To explain why these deaths clustered where they did, around the same kinds of work, the same narrow technical worlds, and the same moment in history, the earliest explanations were mundane, even uncomfortable in how ordinary they sounded. By the mid-1980s, Britain's defense sector was shrinking. Projects were being cancelled, delayed, or subjected to sudden scrutiny. Engineers and analysts were working long hours inside compartmentalized systems, often without clarity about where their work fit or whether it would survive the next review. Several of the men who died were reported to be under strain, ill, injured, redeployed, or preparing to leave their positions. It was possible to argue that this was a high-pressure environment producing tragic outcomes. Sometimes, the simplest explanations are the saddest. Others theorize that these men were working with information about systems that protected national security, the kind of work that doesn't just reveal what can be done, it reveals what can't be done. If these men knew of weaknesses, they could have been targets of international espionage. If the Soviets were looking for insights into the defense development pipeline, perhaps they selected these men to interrogate and dispatch. Or maybe they were looking to slow down preliminary design, so they targeted key players. Or perhaps it was something worse. Intelligence institutions sometimes act to contain embarrassment, failure, or loss of control. MI5 acknowledged reviewing at least one of these deaths. In other cases, documents were reportedly removed. It's clear they were attempting to manage perception and truth. Although unlikely, perhaps they eliminated these researchers to hide what they knew. Furthermore, Marconi itself was under unprecedented scrutiny. In a 2-year investigation that began in late 1986, the same period many of these deaths occurred, the Ministry of Defense launched what would become the largest fraud inquiry in their history. The probe examined contracts involving radios, torpedoes, secure communications, and other advanced defense systems. Police raided Marconi facilities, including the Portsmouth plant. Hundreds of files were seized. 4 men were eventually charged, including 3 former senior executives. Among them, a former manager of Marconi Space and Defense Systems. The investigation spanned multiple Marconi subsidiaries, many directly involved in defense and SDI-related work. If defense contracting is governed by secrecy, liability, and reputation, it would make sense that even within the organization, containment was necessary at all costs. Maybe the government, or maybe the companies, sought to insulate themselves by removing their own contractors for what they knew or what they had seen. These theories sought to explain the deaths as a result of stress, international espionage, or institutional pressures. If these explanations try to make the deaths feel explainable, the following theory does the opposite. It suggests that the story didn't just contain secrets, but something fundamentally unknown. In 1982, Britain and Argentina fought a short, violent conflict over the Falkland Islands, a remote territory in the South Atlantic. In the public record, the war is remembered as a conventional military campaign. Landings, airstrikes, naval losses, ending in a decisive British victory that restored control of the islands. But that history has an underside. In the final days of the war, British forces carried out a little-known operation far south of the Falklands themselves on Thule Island. Officially, it was a cleanup mission, the quiet removal of an Argentinian military outpost. The mission was later referred to as Operation Keyhole. Thule Island is remote and hostile. It's a volcanic island, one of the southernmost on the planet. It's exposed to permanent sub-Antarctic conditions, cold and inaccessible for much of the year. It was rumored that an installation base was located on the island, one that did not belong to the British or the Argentinians. And within this satellite base, there was a material unlike anything known to man. A black fluid substance that was described as adaptive and intelligent. Some theories describe this substance as programmable nanotechnology or some form of bioorganic computer compound. Accounts agree that the extreme cold of the South Atlantic had kept the material dormant. The British forces, under the cover of war, allegedly recovered the substance and transported it to the United Kingdom for study. This is where the theory intersects with Marconi. Proponents argue that the men who died were casualties of contagion or cover-up. They were researchers who worked in simulation, signal interpretation, and systems modeling. In the contagion explanation, the black goo is referred to as some sort of collective and sentient intelligence, a malignant and conscious parasite, and even mere proximity can induce paranoia, irrational behavior, depression, and psychosis. This would explain the bizarre actions and dangerous conclusions of the Marconi scientists. Alternatively, some proponents believe these were loose ends being tied up by intelligence agencies to prevent any leakage. The black goo narrative persists because it mirrors the structures of the Marconi mystery itself, something invisible, adaptive, and corrosive to certainty, hiding just below the surface. The easiest way to betray a question is to search for an answer. A foreign hit squad, a domestic cover-up, an extraterrestrial liquid. Answers that attempt to close all other lines of inquiry. It began with a single death, then another. Men working defense contracting, overlapping departments and classified projects. It was only later that someone connected them and tried to tell a story. A story about men who worked to reduce annihilation to a set of variables. A story that tried to explain the deaths as coincidence, conspiracy, or calculation. Stories that are all vulnerable to the same weakness, anomalies, details that refuse to line up, timelines that break down. Maybe one of the theories surrounding the Marconi Conspiracy are true. The darker possibility is that none of them need to be. In a saturated environment, explanations behave like decoys. They multiply, overlap, and interfere with one another until no single signal can be isolated. 1,000 competing stories are more effective than one suppressed truth. It's a mechanism that is not unique to this case. What remains is not certainty, not closure, only the question, and the question is the only real truth.